Welcome, IT changemakers, to the DEX Show with Tim Flower and Tom McGraw. Let's get into it.
Hello, changemakers. Welcome back to the DEX Show. I'm Tom McGraw. I'm here with Tim Flower. What's going on, Tim?
Hey, Tom, it's been a while since I was out on the road. A nice little downtime at the house, but back out on the road. Took the train down to DC to work with some cool connections to government and defense. So it's nice to get out and about again.
Listen, I guess you were visiting DC in quite a week. You know, DC's been quite a focal point, shall we say, in the world media over the last few days.
Yeah, I think that's a different episode, Tom.
Okay, a whole different conversation. Well, listen, we this week we got to record what we called our emergency podcast with Garang. Wonderful conversation, wonderful episode, obviously covering the CrowdStrike incident and the response to it. And one thing I was thinking, Tim, as we prepared for this episode and prepared to introduce our guest today, is that it's a pretty amazing illustration of what we're discussing today, right? Because you saw organizations which had undertaken painstaking organizational change, and because of the measures they'd taken, because of the care and investment and seriousness they'd gone about it, they were by and large, many of the ones, certainly our customers, were able to escape severe consequences of that incident. And it seems really teed up, I feel, to welcome Greg Satell to the DEX Show. He's a co-founder of ChangeOS, a transformation and change advisory. He's also an international keynote speaker and a best-selling author of Cascades, How to Create a Movement that Drives Transformational Change, and also mapping innovation. And Greg, welcome to the show. We reached out to you weeks ago before we knew this was going to be such a pertinent conversation, right?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Tim and Tom.
Great pleasure. So before we get into the sort of the specifics of the themes that you cover quite extensively, can you share what inspired you to move in the direction of somebody who writes specifically about innovation and transformation with such a focus?
Well, it's a kind of a funny story. I was in 2004. I found myself running a major media and news organization in Ukraine during the Orange Revolution.
No way.
And and it was one of those moments where the universe kind of opens itself up and reveals a bit of itself to you. And I realized that the world didn't work the way I thought it did. Where we grow up and we think that, okay, there's certain power structures at work and they kind of, play the music and we dance the tune. But then all of a sudden, nobody with any conventional form of power had any ability to shape events at all. And there just seemed to be this mysterious force that was moving things along. And here I was running an 800-person company of a lot of, smart, ambitious young people, all with ideas of their own. And I wanted them to embrace the one or two priorities that I thought we needed to pursue. So I looked at what was going on in the Orange Revolution and I said, I'd like to do that. I'd like to I'd like to bottle that force, whatever it is, and put it to some good use. But I had no idea how to do that. And that's what set me out on my 15-year-long journey that led to my book Cascades, to understand change and how to make it happen.
So if I think back to the Orange Revolution, my contemporary history not the strongest, but my sense of it is that it was quite a sort of decentralized movement. Is that an accurate description? Does that parallel what you were thinking had so much kind of organizational potential?
That's how it seemed at the time. At this time, it seemed very spontaneous. Later, I would find that it was very much organized,
Right.
and I wouldn't say centralized, um, but I would say it was engineered, and a lot of it has to do with social networks, but a lot of it has to do with principles that were developed by a guy named Gene Sharp back in the 1960s, and perfected by a guy named Serja Popovich, who's become a friend of mine, who led the movement that overthrew Milosevic in Serbia, and then trained the guys in the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and then the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and since has been active in over 50 countries. And when I got the chance to meet Serja and to get to know him and to learn about what he did, uh, of course, spending 15 years in Eastern Europe, you get an opportunity to do a decent amount of transformation yourself. And when I heard when he explained to me how he had achieved these things, I said, "Well, that seems like a good model for organizational change." And that's what led me to the research that became the book Cascades, and my practice with organizational change today, that I work with uh, organizations of all types.
Fascinating. But I was going to jump into the sort of, the dimension of technology leadership and such like, which we're going to go into. But I feel I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, Greg, to maybe flesh out those parallels or where you saw that potential for organizational impact in this model of social change effectively.
Um, that actually isn't that interesting. It just I had, I'd run a number of organizations, um and so I had experienced organizational change myself, and the types of things that he was talking about just resonated with me. I think you need to start with how organizational change is practiced today. And there's a number of change management frameworks, or so-called OCM, or organizational change management. And they have names like ProSci, ADKAR, uh, Cotter, 8 Steps, Lewin, what have you. But you look into them, and they're not particularly evidence-based. I mean, John Cutter was a Harvard uh, business school professor, who went and you know talked to a bunch of executives and did case study interviews. And of course, when he talked to these executives, they told him stories in which they were the heroes. I mean, big surprise.
Hmm.
When they talked about change, they said their stories tended to be, well, our change was successful, which because I'm so clever, and it was all centered on me and things that I did. Well, maybe, but you know, that's a bit self-serving, right? So when you look at, ADKAR, or you look at Cotter's 8 Steps, it tends to be focused on the change leader rather than the organizational dynamics, which, okay, maybe sometimes it does work like that. But, we've got like 50, 60 years of research from sociology, psychology, network science, political science, that says change works a very different way. Um, There's one strand of it that comes from Everett Rogers, who studied how ideas diffuse. Another strand of it comes from Gene Sharp and social and political movements. There's a whole nother brand of it that comes from studying networks and how networks cascade, and people like Duncan Watts are leaders in that type of research. But they all pretty much agree with each other, and not with the and not with what comes out of the change management research. And there's pretty much four principles that we know from the science that hold true. The first is that change tends to come from outside the community and incurs resistance. And I can't stress enough, that is the very first principle you need to embrace. Anytime you set out to change what people think or what people do, there's going to be those who aren't going to like it, and they're going to resist and work to undermine you in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. And you need to internalize that before you can move forward. The second is that change follows an S curve, meaning it starts off slowly, hits eventually, if you're successful, it hits an inflection point, and which unlocks a cascade and uh, exponential acceleration, and eventually leads to widespread change. The third is that there is something called a cap gap, meaning that changes in knowledge and attitudes don't necessarily uh, result in changes in practice. We might know that we shouldn't eat the brownie. It doesn't mean that we're not going to eat the brownie. And in very similar way, every organization has not has knowing doing gaps. And the fourth and the last one is that change propagates through peer networks. We tend to adopt the changes we see working around us, not the ones that are broadcasted to us. So those are the four principles that we know from the research, and I think any change program needs to be rooted in them.
Got it. Got it. I mean, so let's see if we can relate these principles kind of more concretely to IT. So how can CIOs or other IT leaders, do you think, build and utilize these kinds of networks inside their organizations and these principles in general?
Well, the first place to start is, what's the vision, right? Uh, what are you trying to achieve? And secondly, what's the grievance? When we work with organizations, they tend to have one or the other, but not both. So, for example, if you want to, I don't know, implement an agile transformation, well, that's a fairly clear vision. But what's the actual grievance? What's the problem you're trying to solve? Quite often, especially in innovative initiatives, we find that they have a vision, but not the grievance. So it's a solution for a problem that hasn't been defined, and that can often seem like irrelevant. Secondly, you need to think seriously about the resistance you're you're going to incur. So one of the first things we do is sit down and go through a resistance inventory. We have 5 categories of resistance, and we go through each one, think about who's going to resist in this way, what form is that resistance going to take, and how can we mitigate that resistance. So you can't anticipate everything, but if you sit down and think about it, you can anticipate quite a bit. And the problem is, in the beginning, most people, most organizations don't really think through resistance. Rather, they tend to um, cheerlead the idea for change. And any talk about resistance is almost seen as disloyalty. So that's a sure sign that that's a sure way to fail. Unless you think about resistance from the start, then you're just going to get caught in the trap of reacting to it when it comes about, and that's obviously not a successful way to go about things. But I would say the most important thing is you need to understand that change is not some sort of hero's journey where you have this alternative future vision, and that if you're good enough and you do all the right things, somehow to uh, you'll get to that place. But rather, change is a strategic conflict between that future vision and the status quo. And the status quo always has sources of power
Hmm.
keeping it in place. And those sources of power have an institutional basis. And those form pillars that support the current state. So if you're going to change the status quo, you need to identify those pillars and influence them to bring change about.
This is a great segue, Greg, because it's top of mind for me. We mentioned at the top of the show that I'm down in DC, working with a customer who is looking to implement change. They are a current
Mhm.
customer, um, but I'm sure there's parallels between social and government change as well as change in business. Um, it's this whole concept of uh, innovation ROI or change ROI, right? You've got the change management process, you've got the cheerleader versus uh, 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 the pushback. You identify the problem, you make sure that you're able to implement in a logical way. But the other side of the coin is a lot of that change requires funding. I'm curious if you see any of this, if you see some kind of the common challenges, maybe at an IT leadership, a CIO leadership, or just leadership in general, getting all the psychological and social pieces nailed down, but continuing to struggle with the hurdle of innovation ROI or change ROI.
It's a great question, Tim. So let's try and help your client, right? So your client, I assume, is an IT organization, right? And they have a solution for a problem they've defined. And that solution is going to change the status quo in some way. So what if you're actually going to bring the change about, you need to understand the sources of power that support the current state. Some of them are going to be internal. So there are internally in the organization, there are functional groups, there are departments, there are different power centers within the organization. There are also external institutions. These can be customers, they can be professional organizations, they can be partners, regulators, labor unions. I mean, the possibilities are endless. But these are all institutions that have power that can affect the outcome. So once you identify them, you want to think about which ones support the current state, which support the status quo, which support that alternative future state, and which are somewhat on the fence. And once you start doing that, you can analyze them in terms of their level of influence and their level of support. And that's how you can build out what we call a power matrix. Um, and you can start you can start to envision what are your targets for influence. And once you've identified the targets, then you can start thinking about your tactics. So all too often people think about tactics first. We need to do a social campaign, or wouldn't it be great if we did a hackathon? But unless you've identified what you're trying to influence first,
Mm-hmm.
those tactics aren't going to be successful. So you want to identify your targets and then design your tactics. So I hope that's helpful.
It does. And, it pertains not only to Nextink as a vendor, but to a lot of our customers as well, internally trying to pitch innovation and modernization. We've said it for years. Our biggest competition is status quo. It's the easy path. It's the cheap path. I don't need to fund it. I don't need to go through change management. What I'm doing today works. Why would I change? So status quo is a big,
and there are institutions that are invested in it.
Yeah.
Those, I think a great example from IT is Dell's direct model.
Mm.
And if you talk to people from Compaq and HP, they all knew that Dell had a superior model, that Dell was eating their lunch. But they tried to adopt it. It wasn't a complicated model. But you start thinking about all the people who supported the status quo. You had your enterprise salespeople who had built their careers based
Mm-hmm.
on their relationships with resellers. You
Right.
had partners. You had all of these institutional forces that were working against the direct model. And Tim, when you look at cultures, we tend to look at behaviors. And we say, well, these are behaviors that we don't like, and we
Mm-hmm.
want to change them. So we devise incentives. So we go to those enterprise salespeople and say, hey, we're going to change your incentives to sort of steer you towards this direct model because we want you to change your behavior. But the truth is that culture isn't just behaviors. It also involves norms and rituals. So, and these form a complex. So unless you're changing those norms and rituals, unless you're changing that mindset of the enterprise salesperson who really likes, taking that that customer for dinner, or really looking after their needs and servicing that customer, you're not going to change the behaviors. Which is why companies like Compaq and HP were never able to adopt that direct model of Dell that was so successful, even though they knew that they needed to.
Yeah, I came up through the ranks at Digital Equipment. Compaq ate our lunch, and then HP ate Compaq's lunch. I've seen that the struggle
Well,
of enterprise struggling to adopt to modernization.
that's a fantastic example. A good friend of mine, Annalise Saxenian, wrote a book about that called Regional Advantage, about how the culture of the Boston companies,
Yeah,
which was very vertical. If you left DEC, you became a trader. Whereas
yeah,
where the Silicon Valley model was much more network and ecosystem based.
yep.
Those different cultures really determined the strategy, and not just DEC, but Data General and all of the Boston companies were unable to change those norms and rituals that were so embedded, which is why the behavior never changed.
Well, it's what spawned the non-compete agreements. They were so negative on change that they forced their employees to stay with non-compete agreements.
And even if you took away the non-compete agreements,
Yeah,
The culture of those companies was very much against, people leaving.
Yep.
And obviously the non-compete agreements were part of it, but I suspect if you took away all of those non-compete agreements, little would have changed.
I have friends that I left DEC after 8 years. They went through that time period longer than me at DEC. They went through the entire time period at Compaq. They retired from HP. So it was ingrained in them that this is my company and I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah, I don't think the lack of non-compete agreements would have changed that.
I agree. So let's switch gears a little bit. It wouldn't be a tech show if we didn't talk about AI. It's the biggest innovation and transformation going right now. Um, it's changing fundamentally not only how enterprises work, but how employees work, and it's changing it at an extraordinary rate. It's almost like the tail wagging the dog, right? This new technology is out and it's now changing. How do we adopt? How do we adapt? How do we come up with the right strategy? What are your thoughts on the role of the top senior leadership, the CIOs, in integrating AI technologies, both with the IT tools that we use as well as the broader application portfolio? AI has to be done in a strategic way, but how do CIOs make it happen?
So this is something I'm actively working with a guy named Todd McLeese, and he's got a company called Human Skills. And I think the core principle is that the future of technology is always more human,
Mm,
and digital transformation is always human transformation. So as every time we automate a an activity, every time something's automated, it becomes commodified, and um, and value shifts to a higher level. So if you look at companies that are really good at automation, and I think an Apple Store is a great example of this, which is hugely automated. But you go in there, and what do you see? You see like a sea of blue shirts.
yeah.
It's not that they've eliminated people; it's that they've upgraded them. So that's the question. How can you upgrade the humans? And the key thing is that everybody's going to change at their own pace. That's why we focus on what's called a keystone change, which is a concrete and tangible change that involves multiple stakeholders and paves the way for future change. And when we think about big changes, we always want to start big. But the right way is to start small. And when we work with organizations on a keystone change, we always say, how can we make it smaller?
Mm,
How can we shrink it down? How can we start with one team, one process, one location, one whatever, and build success? Because once you build that first success, then you can start scaling it out. But if you try and change the entire organization from the beginning, you're going to run into all those institutional sources of power that support the status quo. So instead of, and here's a crucial concept, Tim. When you feel the urge to persuade, that's a red flag. That
mm,
means you either have the wrong change or the wrong people. You always want to start with a majority. You can always expand a majority out, even if that's 3 people in a room of 5. But once you're in the minority, you're going to feel immediate pushback. So go find people who are enthusiastic about the idea, whether that's one process owner or you know, one location manager or one whatever who wants the idea to succeed, and get working with them on a keystone change that you can use as a basis to build traction.
It's interesting. You had earlier said that a lot of successful change or reasons for change come from the grassroots, come from the outer edges, and build support to make a change, especially in social situations. There are times, however, where enterprise leadership and CIOs and the C-suite sees a problem and needs to make a singular decision to change from the top and convince lots of people that this is the right change. What's in terms of like maybe a case study in implementing change from the top? What are your thoughts about how CIOs, and maybe we target it to employee experience, the digital employee experience, how can CIOs communicate the right way, not only to their own teams to again get them on board, but also to the business leadership and the masses of employees that are going to have to get on board with this change that's kind of being driven from the top? What are some strategies to get people on board?
Well, I think what you need to start with is the realization that nothing slows you down like failure,
Mm,
right? And anytime you set out to change what people think and what they do, there's always going to be some who aren't going to like it, and they're going to work to undermine you in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. And anybody who's ever tried to change anything knows that.
yeah.
So what you want to avoid is that big rollout, that big launch uh, event, that because that's going to trigger that resistance even before you start. You know, Ed Catmull, one of my favorite quotes ever, the founder of Pixar, he said that new ideas are like ugly babies. They need to be protected. You know, they need to be nurtured. What you don't want to do is drop your baby off at a biker bar, right? You don't want to expose that baby to the roughest type of resistance you can possibly have. And a big launch event is pretty much guaranteed to do that. So what you want to do is say, who's willing to nurture this ugly baby? And I don't think it's true that change always starts at the periphery. Change often starts at the center, and I think the turnaround at IBM is the best example of
Right.
that. And I've interviewed dozens of executives at IBM from that time period. And Lou Gerstner, he went and found the people who were excited about the idea, and he started with them. So go find somebody who actually wants this idea to succeed, who's willing to nurture this ugly baby and build a success. And you need to start with people who are willing to undergo a few initial failures. If you want to start big, one failure and you're going to be done, right? That's going to empower the naysayers. But if you start with people who want it to succeed, they'll push through and they'll find a way to make it work. And then you have something to build on. What I think is important is that is to understand that change is nonlinear, right? We know that it follows an S curve. It starts out slowly. Eventually, if you're successful, it will hit an inflection point, which will unlock a cascade. That we even know where that inflection point is. It tends to be, and we have decades of research that show this. It tends to be between 10 and 20% participation. So your goal isn't to, convince everybody at once. Your goal is, to build that 1-2% that can grow into that 10-20%. And once you build into that 10-20%, then it'll naturally accelerate. So you want to move slower in order to go fast.
Yeah, I'm going to give the conversation back to Tom from here, but I love the baby analogy. We're often in a position where we have to go in and actually call the prospective customer's baby ugly. And we said it out loud at one meeting. We said, listen, we really don't want to offend you, but we got to call your baby ugly. And we knew we had someone who was willing to change because they looked at us and said, we don't care if you call it ugly. We just want to stop dropping the baby.
Yeah. I mean, change needs, and Tim, it's such an important point. Change needs to be protected,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the early stages. And if you don't protect that change, if you don't protect that baby, if you just drop the baby off at the biker bar,
Mm-hmm.
chances are the baby's not going to survive.
We've got so many baby analogies flying around here, guys. We've got ugly babies, babies dropped off at biker bars, babies we've got to
Babies getting
change.
dropped.
I'm getting lost in this nursery of metaphor, guys. I am. But listen, Greg, what a timely and wonderful discussion, really. Like to finish, please, if you could sort of surmise and condense advice for CIOs. Maybe they just narrowly missed CrowdStrike, maybe they didn't. And they're thinking, okay, we do need to instigate change in this organization and transformation. What would be your sort of inner nucleus, your advice to them as they begin this journey?
Well, go out and find somebody who thinks like you do and start with them. There's a human tendency that when we feel passionate about an idea, we want to go and convince the skeptics. We want to go tell people who hate the idea and somehow convince them that it's good. So don't do that. It's a bad idea. Go out and find someone who loves the baby just as much as you do and empower them to make the change work, and then build from there. Transformations are always about small groups, loosely connected, but united by a shared purpose. The job of a change leader is to help those groups to connect and inspire them with a shared sense of mission and purpose, not to take the change on their back and make it all happen themselves.
Wonderful, wonderful. And where can listeners find more about you and your work, Greg?
So you can see my blog at digitaltonto.com. If you want to work with me, you can go to my site, gregsatell.com. And just launching tomorrow is our new website, our new podcast website, which is changemakermindset.net, where we interview people who make an impact in all sorts of walks of life and fields, and uncover how they made it happen.
Well, there are many change makers in this audience, Greg. So
Right.
hopefully you find some new listeners and people to talk to. Greg, absolute pleasure. Such a timely conversation, but really happy to have had you on the show regardless. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Greg.
To make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to leave a rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. If you'd like to learn more about how NextThink can help you improve your digital employee experience, head over to nextthink.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.